William Garrett stood at the edge of the clearing, watching steam rise from the ground in rhythmic pulses. Every 6 hours, like clockwork, the earth here erupted, not violently but reliably. Hot water shot 15 feet into the air, held for 30 seconds, then subsided back into the rocky opening. He'd been studying this geyser for 3 months now, and he'd never seen it vary by more than a few minutes. Most folks in town thought the land was cursed. Some thought it was dangerous. Old Martha Fenton claimed it was the devil's tea kettle. But William saw something different. He saw free heat, endless and reliable, rising from deep in the earth exactly where he needed to build his homestead. The land had been cheap, cheaper than anything else in the territory, because nobody wanted to live near an active thermal feature. The previous owner had abandoned it after a single winter, spooked by the regular eruptions and convinced the whole thing would blow up eventually. William had bought it with the last of his savings, and when he told people his plans, they'd looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're going to build on top of that thing?" Samuel Chen had asked at the land office, his eyebrows disappearing into his hairline. "William, that geyser could boil you alive?" "Not on top of it," William had corrected patiently. "Near it, close enough to use it." Use it for what? Heating. The silence that followed had been profound. Samuel had eventually processed the paperwork, but William had seen him shaking his head all the way out the door. William had spent years working on steam engines for the railroad before coming west. He understood pressure, temperature, and how water behaved when heated. What he saw in this geyser wasn't danger, it was potential. The water emerged at roughly 190 degrees, hot enough to burn on contact, but not hot enough to create dangerous steam pressure if managed correctly. The regular cycle meant predictable behavior, and the sheer volume of hot water meant he could heat an entire house through the coldest winter without burning a single cord of wood. The trick was in the engineering. He started by mapping the geyser's behavior in detail. He timed every eruption for a week, noting the duration, the height of the spray, and the temperature at various distances from the opening. The water that didn't evaporate during the eruption flowed away through a natural channel in the rock, cooling as it went. William calculated that if he could intercept some of that water while it was still hot and route it through a system of pipes, he could extract the heat without ever interfering with the geyser itself. His cabin design took shape over long evenings spent sketching by lamplight. He would build his house 20 feet from the geyser, close enough to run pipes efficiently, far enough to avoid any direct danger from the eruptions. The foundation would be stone, raised on the uphill side to stay dry. And beneath the floorboards, he would install a network of iron pipes that would carry hot water from the geyser, radiate heat into the rooms above, and return the cooled water back to the thermal outflow channel. When he showed his plans to David Thornton, the town's blacksmith and the closest thing the settlement had to an engineer, David had studied them for a long time before speaking. "This is clever, William, damn clever, but you're asking for trouble." "How so?" "What if the geyser changes? What if it gets hotter or erupts longer or—" "It's been doing the same thing for as long as anyone remembers. The geology here is stable." "Geology you understand from working on steam engines?" David's tone was skeptical, but not unkind. "Geology I understand from reading every book on thermal springs and volcanic activity I could find. This geyser isn't volcanic. It's just groundwater hitting hot rock deep down and rising back up. The cycle is consistent because the heat source is consistent." David had drummed his fingers on the drawings. "And these pipes? You want iron?" "For the hot sections, yes. Iron can handle the temperature. For the return flow where the water's cooled, I can use copper. It's easier to work with and won't rust. You know this is going to cost you near everything you have left." "I know. And if it fails, you'll freeze come winter." It won't fail. David had looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, I'll forge what you need. But William, if this goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you. The construction took all summer. William worked dawn to dusk, first on the foundation, then on the framework. He'd chosen to build with stone where he could. Stone absorbed heat well and released it slowly, which would help stabilize the temperature inside. The walls were thick, insulated with sawdust between double layers of planking. Every window was small and south-facing to maximize winter sun while minimizing heat loss. The foundation alone took 3 weeks. William had to excavate carefully, working around the geyser's natural drainage patterns. He mapped where water flowed during eruptions, where it pooled, where it drained. The stone foundation rose in careful courses, each layer mortared and checked for level. He built in a slight slope to direct any potential water away from the structure, and he created channels beneath the foundation stones where his pipes would eventually run. Neighbors rode by regularly to watch, most shaking their heads at what they considered folly. Thomas Reed, who owned the property to the north, stopped one afternoon and called out, "William, you know that thing's going to shake your house apart when it erupts, don't you?" William had climbed down from the wall he was building. "The geyser's 20 feet away, Thomas. The vibrations are minimal at this distance. I've measured them." "Measured them how?" "Set up a pan of water on a level surface at various distances. Watch the ripples during eruptions. At 20 feet, there's barely any movement. At 15, you start to see some disturbance. That's why I'm building here and not closer." Thomas had looked skeptical but intrigued. "You really have thought about this?" "Every angle I can think of. I can't afford to be wrong." As the walls rose, William incorporated features he'd learned from his time with steam systems. He installed ventilation channels that would allow moisture to escape without losing heat, critical in a house heated by water circulation. He positioned the windows not just for light, but for passive solar gain, knowing that even winter sun could contribute to warming. And he designed the roof with a steep pitch that would shed snow efficiently while providing good insulation value. Lizzie Parker, who ran the general store, rode out to see the progress one afternoon. She sat on her horse watching William mortaring stones, and finally called out, "William Garrett, what in heaven's name are you doing?" He climbed down from the wall he was building. "Afternoon, Lizzie. Just working on my house." "Your house that's going to explode when that geyser decides to blow." "It's not going to blow. It's been regular as a clock for decades. Until it isn't." She gestured at the rhythmic plume of steam rising from the rocky opening. "That's not natural, William. It's not safe. It's perfectly natural. It's just hot water finding its way to the surface. And as for safe, Lizzie, I spent 5 years working with boilers that could actually explode. I know what dangerous pressure looks like. This isn't it. The other folks in town think you've gone peculiar." William allowed himself a small smile. "They might be right, but I'll be warm this winter while they're burning through cord after cord of firewood." She'd paused, looking at him more carefully. "You're serious about this, aren't you? This isn't some lark or experiment. This is my home, Lizzie. My future. I'm as serious as I've ever been about anything." Lizzie had shaken her head and ridden off, but not before he'd seen the worry in her eyes. She wasn't mocking him, she was genuinely concerned. That was something, at least. The interior work required equal care. William installed the iron pipes in their serpentine pattern beneath what would become his floor, carefully calculating the spacing to ensure even heat distribution. Each joint had to be perfect. Any leak would mean tearing up flooring to repair it. He tested each section as he went, running cold water through to check for drips or weak connections before moving on to the next section. Robert Hayes showed up one afternoon and watched in fascination as William soldered a joint. "How did you learn to do all this?" the young man asked. "Piece by piece. Some from books, some from working on steam engines, some from trial and error. You interested in learning?" "Very much so." William had handed him a length of pipe and some flux. "Then get to work. I'll show you how." The pipe system was the most complex part of the project. William had designed it in 3 stages. First, a collection basin carved into the rock near the geyser's outflow, where hot water would pool briefly before entering the pipes. Second, the main circulation loop, iron pipes running beneath the cabin floor in a serpentine pattern, maximizing surface area for heat transfer. Third, a return channel that fed the cooled water back into the natural drainage, well downstream of the geyser itself. The challenge was controlling the flow. Too much hot water, and the pipes could crack from thermal stress. Too little, and the system wouldn't heat efficiently. William solved this with a simple valve system, bronze fittings he'd commissioned from David, designed to let him adjust the flow rate while keeping pressure manageable. "You're sure these won't seize up?" David had asked, examining his own work critically. "Not if we keep them clean and I don't let them corrode. The water's mineral heavy, so I'll need to flush the system periodically, but that's manageable." "And if there's a blockage?" "Then I bypass the system and heat with a wood stove until I can clear it. I'm not abandoning conventional heating entirely. I'm just making it supplementary instead of primary." David had handed over the valves with a mixture of respect and resignation. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've tried to." By the time the first snow fell, the house was finished. It was a solid structure, thick stone walls, tight-fitting doors and windows, and beneath it all, the network of pipes waiting to prove themselves. William had also extended a smaller pipe run to a sheltered stable he'd built for his horse, Sable. If the system worked as designed, both he and his horse would stay warm all winter without burning more than a few armfuls of kindling. The town's reaction when he announced he was moving in ranged from concern to outright horror. At the church social in late autumn, practically everyone had an opinion. "You'll wake up one morning and find yourself parboiled," old Martha Fenton announced loudly. "The geyser will change and flood your house," added George Kimball, who farmed to the east. "It's not right living that close to something that unnatural," his wife Eleanor murmured, making a sign against evil. William had endured it patiently, explaining for the dozenth time that the geyser was predictable, that his system was designed with multiple safety measures, that he'd studied this for months. Most people listened politely and remained unconvinced. Only a few were genuinely curious. Samuel Chen asked detailed questions about the pipe routing. David Thornton, who'd helped build the system, defended the engineering to skeptics. And young Robert Hayes, barely 20 and newly arrived from back east, peppered William with questions about thermal dynamics and pressure differentials. "You studied this at a university?" Robert asked eagerly. "Studied it in engine houses and from books," William replied. "But yes, the principles are the same. Heat is heat, whether it's coming from burning coal or hot rock a mile underground." "Do you think you could teach me? About the system, I mean?" William had looked at the young man's earnest face and smiled. "Come by once I'm settled. I'll show you how it works." The first real test came in November. The temperature dropped below freezing, and William lit no fires. Instead, he opened the valves on his pipe system and let the hot water from the geyser begin its circulation through the network beneath his floor. The effect was remarkable. Within an hour, the stone floor was warm to the touch. Within 3 hours, the entire cabin was comfortable. Not hot, but warm enough that he could move around in shirt sleeves while snow fell outside. The thick walls held the heat beautifully, and the stone continued radiating warmth long after he'd reduced the flow rate to a trickle for the night. Sable's stable was similarly warm. The horse, who'd been showing signs of stress as the weather turned cold, relaxed immediately. William stood in the stable that first evening, running his hand along Sable's neck, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. It worked. Everything he'd planned, all the calculations and careful engineering, it worked. But the town remained skeptical. When William rode in for supplies, people asked pointed questions. "Haven't frozen yet?" Lizzie asked from behind the counter. "Not even close. The house stays around 65 degrees with minimal effort." "And when the geyser stops?" "Then I light a fire in the stove like anyone else." "But Lizzie, that geyser's been running since before this town existed. I don't think it's going to stop now." She'd packed his supplies with practiced efficiency, then surprised him by asking, "Does it really work as well as you say?" "Come see for yourself. Bring Marcus. I'll make coffee and show you the whole system." She'd nodded slowly. "Maybe I will." The first visitors came a week later, Lizzie and her husband Marcus, along with Samuel Chen and his wife Julia. William welcomed them warmly, showed them through the house, and explained the system while they stood on his warm stone floor in their heavy coats, gradually shedding layers as they realized he wasn't exaggerating. "I can't hear any boiler," Marcus said, puzzled. "Where's the noise?" "There isn't one. The water flows naturally. The geyser's pressure does all the work. I'm just directing it through pipes instead of letting it run off into the creek." "And it stays this warm?" Julia asked, touching the floor with visible amazement. "Warmer when I want it to be. I keep it moderate to conserve the heat and extend the life of the pipes. But I could have it hot enough to make you uncomfortable if I opened the valves fully." Samuel knelt and examined the visible section of pipe where it emerged from the floor near the wall. "This is iron?" "For the hot water sections, copper for the return flow. The iron can handle the temperature without warping." "And you're not afraid of it bursting?" "The pressure is minimal, nothing like a boiler. The water's hot, but it's not under significant pressure once it's in my system. That's the advantage of using natural flow rather than trying to contain steam." They'd stayed for an hour, asking questions and marveling at the constant warmth. When they left, William could see the shift in their expressions. He wasn't crazy after all. He was simply ahead of his time. But the real test came in January. The winter that year was brutal, the kind that old-timers would talk about for decades. Temperatures stayed well below zero for weeks. Snow piled up in drifts that buried fences and made travel nearly impossible. And the wind. The wind was relentless, finding every crack and gap in even the best-built homes, stealing heat faster than fires could replace it. William's house stayed warm. The geyser, unaffected by surface weather, continued its 6-hour cycle. The hot water flowed through his pipes, radiating heat into the stone, keeping his home comfortable while the world outside became increasingly hostile. He reduced the flow at night and increased it in the morning, adjusting to maintain a steady temperature without wasting heat. And Sable, in his stable with its own heating loop, remained healthy and calm, while horses all over the territory suffered from the cold. The town wasn't as fortunate. Firewood became scarce. Everyone was burning through their supplies faster than anticipated. Houses built with thinner walls or poorer insulation couldn't stay warm no matter how much wood people burned. And the cold didn't just make people uncomfortable, it made them sick. Lung ailments spread through the population as people huddled in inadequately heated homes, breathing smoke-filled air from fires that couldn't quite drive back the chill. William heard about the troubles when he made a supply run in mid-January. The ride into town was treacherous, but Sable was strong, and William had dressed in layers. At the general store, he found Lizzie looking exhausted. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. "Bad. The Thornton family is down to burning furniture. The Fenton house is so cold. Martha's moved in with her daughter. And George Kimball's been coughing up blood. Doctor says it's pneumonia from sleeping in a frigid house." William felt a twist of guilt. He'd been comfortable while his neighbors suffered. "What about the community woodpile?" Exhausted a week ago. David's been trying to organize cutting parties, but it's too cold to work outside for long, and the snow's too deep to drag timber out efficiently. I can help. My house stays warm without wood. I can share my supply. Lizzie looked at him with grateful surprise. William, you'd do that? Of course. I wouldn't have much of a community left otherwise. He spent the next 2 weeks distributing his firewood stores to families in need. The Thorntons got enough to last them a month. The Kimballs got a wagon load, delivered directly to their door, along with instructions from William on banking fires properly to maximize heat output. Martha Fenton, swallowing her pride, accepted 2 cords with barely concealed relief. Each delivery became a teaching opportunity. At the Thornton house, William didn't just drop the wood and leave. He spent an hour showing David and Margaret how to stack it for optimal drying, how to split it to the right size for their stove, how to arrange the pieces to promote good airflow and complete combustion. You're burning your wood too fast because you're using pieces that are too small, he explained, demonstrating with pieces from their pile. Small pieces catch quickly, but burn out fast. Mix in some larger chunks. They'll burn longer and more evenly. And see how you've got your wood box right next to the stove? Move it back a bit. You're drying out your reserve supply too much, making it burn even faster. Margaret had watched with tired eyes. We've been burning wood our whole lives, William. I know, and you've been burning it the way everyone does, but the way everyone does it isn't always the most efficient way. These are tricks I learned keeping engine houses warm in the winter. Small changes that add up to significant fuel savings. David had tried the new approach that very evening and reported the next day that a single load of wood had lasted nearly twice as long. The word spread, and William found himself making similar house calls throughout the territory. At the Hayes household, he helped young Robert's parents insulate their attic with straw, a messy job that took a full day but reduced their heat loss dramatically. At the Martinez family's cabin, he showed them how to use heated stones as thermal batteries, warming them by the fire during the evening and placing them in beds before sleep to radiate heat through the night. My grandmother used to do this in the old country, Maria Martinez said, watching William demonstrate. I'd forgotten. Old wisdom often has good reasons behind it, William replied. Your grandmother understood that stone holds heat. It's the same principle I'm using in my house, just on a smaller scale. The Chen family had a different problem. Their house was well built, but their stove was positioned poorly, heating only one corner effectively. William helped Samuel rearrange the living space and construct a simple heat reflector from hammered tin sheets, directing warmth toward the center of the room instead of letting it escape through the exterior wall. This is just clever thinking, Samuel said, admiring the result. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just understanding how heat moves and working with it instead of against it. That's exactly it. Most people fight their environment. Better to understand it and adapt. But wood alone wasn't solving the fundamental problem. Houses were too cold, and people were suffering. William found himself lying awake at night, thinking about the problem. His system worked because of the geyser, which he couldn't replicate. But the principles, insulation, thermal mass, reducing heat loss, those could be applied anywhere. He started making house calls, not to deliver wood, but to deliver knowledge. At the Thornton house, he showed David and his wife Margaret how to seal gaps around their windows with strips of cloth soaked in flour paste, creating airtight seals that dried hard. It's not permanent, he explained, but it'll get you through the winter. Come spring, you can chink properly. At the Chen house, he helped Samuel and Julia rearrange their furniture to create smaller, more easily heated living spaces. You're trying to heat your whole house, he explained, but in cold like this, that's a losing battle. Heat 1 or 2 rooms well, and live in those spaces until the weather breaks. He taught Robert Hayes how to build a simple heat reflector from salvaged tin, positioning it behind the wood stove to radiate heat back into the room instead of losing it through the wall. The young man picked up the concepts quickly and began making reflectors for other families, charging only the cost of materials. And he helped George Kimball redesign his chimney damper to reduce heat loss while maintaining enough draft to keep the smoke flowing. It was a delicate balance, but William had learned it working with engine exhaust systems, and the principles translated well. "You're giving away information that could be valuable," Marcus Parker commented one evening when William stopped by for coffee. "Information that could keep people alive is more valuable shared than hoarded," William replied. "Besides, I'm not planning to make my living as a heating consultant." "What are you planning?" William shrugged. "To survive the winter, to help my neighbors do the same, and maybe, if people are willing to listen, to help them build better next year." "They're listening now. You've noticed?" William had noticed. The mockery had stopped. The skepticism had faded. When he rode into town now, people greeted him with respect instead of pity. They asked his advice. They wanted to learn. The turning point came in late January when the mercury dropped to 20 below and stayed there for a week. Even William's system was tested. He had to run the water flow at near maximum to keep the house comfortable. But it worked. While families all over the territory struggled to stay warm, even burning everything they could find, William's house remained a haven of steady, reliable heat. David Thornton rode out one afternoon, struggling through snow that came up to his horse's chest. William welcomed him inside, and David stood on the warm floor for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology." "You don't. Let me finish. When you first showed me these plans, I thought you were smart but reckless, clever but foolish. I was wrong. This," he gestured at the warm, comfortable room, "this is genius, not just for you, but for what it represents. It represents using what's available instead of fighting against it. It represents thinking differently, and that's what we need more of out here." David pulled out a folded paper from his coat. "I've been making some designs of my own, based on what I've learned watching your system and helping folks winterize their homes. Nothing as dramatic as yours. There's only one geyser after all. But better insulation strategies, more efficient stove designs, ways to capture and redistribute heat instead of letting it escape." William unfolded the paper and studied David's sketches. They were good, practical, achievable improvements that any homesteader could implement. "This is excellent work. I was hoping you'd look them over, maybe add your thoughts, and then maybe we could present them to folks come spring. Help people rebuild better. I'd be honored." They spent the afternoon going over David's designs, refining concepts, and discussing materials. By the time David left, they'd outlined a community workshop program for the spring, practical sessions on building and heating that would help everyone prepare for the next winter. As February arrived and the worst of the cold began to break, William found his house becoming an unlikely gathering place. Robert Hayes came regularly to discuss thermal dynamics. Samuel Chen brought questions about adapting the system's principles to a larger building. He was thinking about how to heat the schoolhouse more efficiently. Even young Danny Martinez, who'd been fascinated by the geyser since he was small, started visiting to learn about geology and hydrothermics. "My ma says you're the smartest man in the territory," Danny announced one afternoon, watching William adjust the flow valves. "Your mother is kind, but I'm just someone who paid attention to what was already here. The geyser's been producing heat for thousands of years. I just figured out how to use it. But nobody else thought of it. Because they were taught to see it as dangerous instead of useful. Sometimes the best ideas come from changing how you look at something." The boy had pondered that, watching steam rise from the geyser in the cold afternoon air. "Will you teach me how to see things different?" "I'll teach you what I know. The rest you'll have to figure out yourself." The gatherings at William's house became more frequent as winter progressed. Every Thursday evening, whoever could make the trek would gather in his warm home to discuss building techniques and heating strategies. William would sketch designs on paper, explain principles, and answer questions. The discussions often ran late into the night, fueled by coffee and the collective desire to never endure such hardship again. The community workshops that William and David had planned began to take concrete form. They outlined a 6-week program covering everything from basic insulation to advanced thermal mass applications. Samuel volunteered to host the sessions at the schoolhouse, reasoning that if they were going to discuss heating it more efficiently, they might as well do so in the building itself. "We can use it as a teaching tool," Samuel suggested during one of the Thursday gatherings. "Show people the problems firsthand, then demonstrate the solutions." "That's excellent thinking," William agreed. "Make it practical and immediate. People learn better when they can see the direct application." Robert, who'd been studying William's designs with increasing sophistication, spoke up. "What about a printed guide? Something people could reference after the workshops." "Can you write it?" William asked. "If you'll review it for accuracy, yes. I've been taking notes all winter. I could organize them into a practical manual." "Then do it. Knowledge that isn't shared dies with the person who holds it." The workshops began in March, as soon as travel became safe. Nearly every family in the territory sent someone, and William taught them hands-on from the start. They worked with insulation materials, examined heat loss through different wall constructions, and learned about thermal mass. Eleanor Kimball had a revelation during the second session. "We've been building the same way for generations, not because it was the best way, but because it was the familiar way." William nodded. "Exactly. And when tradition stops serving us, it's time to find a better approach." By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the world to mud, William's house had become a symbol of something larger than innovative heating. It represented the possibility of adaptation, of working with nature instead of against it. The town that had mocked him now sought his counsel. The neighbors who'd predicted disaster now asked him to help design their next year's improvements, and the geyser, the supposedly dangerous, cursed thermal feature that had made the land cheap, continued its reliable cycle, providing heat without complaint, asking nothing in return but a little understanding. One warm evening in April, William sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set over the mountains. The geyser erupted on schedule, its plume catching the golden light. Sable nickered contentedly from his stable, healthy and strong after a winter that had been hard on so many animals. Lizzie and Marcus rode up, surprising him with their visit. "Hope we're not intruding?" Lizzie called out. "Not at all. Coffee?" "Please." They dismounted and settled onto the porch. Marcus accepted his cup gratefully. "We wanted to thank you, William, for everything this winter." "I didn't do anything special." "You kept people from freezing. You shared your wood when you didn't have to. You taught folks how to survive." Lizzie paused. "And you made us all think differently about what's possible out here." "The geyser made it possible." "The geyser was always there. You're the one who saw what it could be." Marcus gestured at the house. "You know there's talk of naming this place after you? Garrett Springs, they're calling it." William smiled. "That seems premature." "It's one house." "It's a start." David's already working with 3 families on better building designs for next year. Samuel's convinced the town council to fund proper insulation for the schoolhouse, and Robert Hayes is planning to attend a technical college back east. He says you inspired him. "Robert inspired himself. I just answered his questions." Lizzie laughed. "You're determined not to take credit, aren't you?" "I'm determined to remember that I almost didn't do this. I almost listened to all the voices saying it was too dangerous, too different, too risky. The only reason this house exists is because I was more afraid of being cold than I was of being wrong. And now? Now I'm just glad I took the chance, and grateful I could help when things got hard. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the steam rise from the geyser in the cooling evening air. The reliable rhythm of the water, the steady pulse of heat from deep in the earth. It had seemed like a threat once. Now it felt like home. "What will you do next?" Marcus asked eventually. William considered the question. "Keep learning. The system works, but I can make it better. There are efficiency improvements I want to try, and I'm thinking about whether I can use the same principles to provide hot water for bathing and laundry. Always innovating. Always trying to make things a little easier. That's what we're all doing out here, isn't it? Trying to build something better than what came before?" "Some of us more successfully than others," Lizzie said with a smile. "But yes, that's exactly what we're doing." After they left, William walked out to check on the geyser one more time before bed. It was a habit now, this evening ritual, checking the flow and adjusting the valves for the night. The water was hot as always, reliable as always, providing heat that rose through his home's bones. He thought about the winter past, about the skepticism and the eventual acceptance, about neighbors helped and knowledge shared, about one young man inspired to pursue learning and one old woman willing to accept help, about a community that had learned to see possibility instead of danger. The geyser erupted right on schedule, its plume catching the last of the twilight. William watched it complete its cycle, then subside back into the earth, already warming the water for its next emergence. 6 hours from now it would erupt again, and 6 hours after that, and 6 hours after that. Reliable as the sunrise, constant as the seasons. He'd built his home on what others saw as cursed ground. He'd trusted in principles that seemed too simple to work. He'd persisted through mockery and skepticism and doubt. And in the end, the heat beneath had proven to be not a curse, but a blessing. Warmth rising from the earth, freely given, waiting only for someone to understand how to use it. William turned back to his warm house, grateful for the geyser, grateful for the warmth, and grateful most of all for having the courage to trust what he knew instead of what he feared. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is listen to the voices that tell you not to try. And sometimes the safest thing you can do is trust the heat beneath.